Hello everyone, welcome to the first chapter of our course dedicated to pattern recognition. As it was mentioned in the introduction, this is a follow-up of the previous course. I hope you've seen it and I hope you liked it. If not, and if you still feel that you may need a little bit of a recap in terms of the foundation of tactical motives, and if you perhaps still need to learn a few things about pins, forks, decoys, deflection, discovered attack in between moves, then this is exactly the course for you. Hopefully the things that were covered in my previous course, in one of my previous courses, the one dedicated to the basics of chess tactical motives, and assuming that those things are pretty much clear for you, then this is a good way to proceed here with this course. So the first chapter is going to deal with fork. I thought it's a good way to have a little bit of a warm-up and try to recap a few things and also show you how fork can actually be a powerful tool, and how to find those tactical ideas in practical games. So as you remember, I hope, fork is a situation where you attack two pieces at the same time, and as a result your opponent cannot prevent himself from losing material. Of course, we're not going to deal with those basic situations where you just make, let's say, a check with the queen and then a king and the rook are under attack. One of the pieces needs to make a move, the king in this case, and then the rook is taken. Here we're going to look at more complex situations, and the first one is exactly in front of you. This is a training position. I don't really think this was taken from any of the games. At least my database doesn't indicate any names here. But this is actually quite irrelevant, because this position could easily occur in any practical game, and you could easily see such a position on the board. So white is on move, and here we need to consider the best move for white. At the very beginning, you're also told to specifically find a particular move or a move connected with some sort of an idea. Since this is a more advanced course, whenever I'm going to try to encourage you to find a good move or find a solution for one of the players, I will try not to help you too much, and I will not indicate what needs to be done. But here, for the sake of instruction, let's just analyze this position briefly, and let's think what needs to be done here. So first of all, it's quite clear that the black knight on e4 is one of the key pieces here, because it attacks the queen on f2, and also it attacks a very important pawn on f6. We can easily imagine the pawn on f6 being taken, and if that happens, it seems that black is going to be pretty much okay. Materially, he's going to be up a pawn after winning the pawn on f6, so that, of course, if possible, should be prevented. So this is a good starting point to think whether this can actually be prevented, because if we make any queen move like queen c2 or queen g2, queen g1, those moves will probably come into consideration. Then black will take either on f6, which is the most probable option, or alternatively he could take on g3, because that's another possibility. So this is usually the starting point of any calculation. So you start with either the moves that subconsciously come to your mind. So one would also say that based on your intuition you decide starting your calculation with this specific move, or you just start with calculating the consequences of the most straightforward options. So in case your opponent attacks your piece, you just escape with it to the most logical square. Here it transpires that this move is not an option, but this is the sort of an defensive approach to this position, and I'm not really sure if this is exactly what should be done here. Of course, this shows how not to blunder pieces, but I'm sure that you've also heard that whenever your opponent makes a move, what you need to do, what you're supposed to do, is to check if you can take anything, if you can capture anything, or to be more specific, if you can win any material, because winning material does not always mean that you need to capture something in just one move. And here this is such a case, right? This is a typical situation where white manages to win some material. And how do we spot a winning continuation, or a continuation that leads to us gaining some material advantage? Well, you need to be looking for sort of vulnerable areas in your opponent's position. Definitely it's quite obvious that the rook on e1 can take the knight on e4, so this is an option if you're looking for some move that will not make you lose the queen. But when it comes down to areas of the board where black is not necessarily well protected, it's quite clear that this is around the king, because as you see, normally you would expect the black pawn formation to be f7, g7, h7. White has a pawn on f6. Also, there is some vulnerability along 8 to g8 diagonal because there's no pawn on f7, and it feels that there might be something there, right? Another thing is that the king on g8 and the rook on e8 are placed in such a way that if we play f7, we actually make a fork. Is this a good continuation, you may wonder? Well, if you calculate just one move, then it transpires that black can just take the pawn on f7, and then it's not really clear what white is supposed to do. It was one check. It looks like a very nice continuation, because after all, we forced the black king to be even more exposed, and theoretically we should be able to well, we could be able to get some attacking chances, but on the other hand, if black gets enough time, if he has time to go back with the king to g8, he might be just well be able to defend himself properly. So then, in order to verify if this f7 idea is any good, you need to check if there is any follow-up. So what you need to do is to imagine that the king is already on f7, that there is no pawn on f6, and basing on that position where the king on f7, you check if there is any follow-up and if there is any forcing continuation. This is usually the best and the easiest way to check if there is any tactics, and in great majority of cases this will be enough. Once you become a stronger player, you will it will become easier for you to understand, to subconsciously find moves that are not necessarily the most straightforward ones, but here this will be enough if you're very very fast and very precise as regards these forcing continuations and very straightforward continuations. So after the king is on f7, another thing needs to be determined. Again, if any forcing continuation can occur. The problem remains the same. So the knight on e4 attacks the queen on f2. But what changed is the placement of the pieces. So when you look at all of your forcing continuations, you find that there is rook takes e4, and probably the other forcing continuation it would be a check, either on e5 or on g5. Knight e5 doesn't look any good, so you consider knight g5, because out of the forcing options, you should always be looking for captures, checks, and threats. So it's not really clear how white is supposed to make a move which is threatening anything. It could be queen c2, but on the other hand, it doesn't look to be so serious, because then the black knight could just go back to f6 or even potentially take on g3. So I'm talking about a line like this, then queen c2 potentially, and if queen c2, black could take on g3 or maybe play bishop c6 as an alternative. Who knows? But this is not so promising. So when you have this position still in mind, f7, king f7, the other move apart from knight e5 or queen c2 would be either rook takes e4 or knight g5. After knight takes g5, okay, it looks nice that you actually give a check on g5 and attack the knight on e4. But obviously, if you attack another knight, then it means that the knight which is attacked can just capture the attacking knight. So after knight g5, the black knight from e4 would just capture your knight on g5, and then you don't really achieve anything specific. On the other hand, if you change the move order a little bit, and first take on e4, the black rook captures back on e4, then finally you are able to play knight g5 check, forking the king on f7 and the rook on e4. The key to success here is the ability to visualize the position properly. So if you're able to imagine in your brain prior to making these moves on the board, this is really important, because once moves are made on the board, there's no turning back. So always keep in mind that you need to be able to take advantage of the position which is still in your brain. What's in your brain is not on the board yet, so you're not bound to play any move that you thought of. Once you touch a piece or even make a move and drop a piece, there's no turning back. You cannot take back the move that you made. So this is really important to anticipate instead of curing, instead of saving the game by minimizing the loss, assuming that you haven't calculated properly. Anyway, after f7, king takes f7, rook takes e4 is the winning move, rook takes back, knight g5 check. Finally, we were able to get rid of the knight that was hitting the queen on f2. And after this forcing continuation, the result is that white is up a piece for a pawn, which is at most levels should be enough, I would say. I'm not going to say this is enough for a win, but should be enough for a win. Of course, when you're calculating a line like that, you should also consider if there are any in-between moves for your opponent. So especially in this position after rook takes e4, there is nothing that black could really do, so logically you just win. And theoretically after f7 there could be some other move that you should maybe take into account. Here probably king h7 or king g7, but none of these moves really make any sense. After king g7 you can just take on e8 and promote to a knight with a check, and then you win a whole rook. After king h7 you could just play knight g5. If knight takes g5, then you win the rook on e8 and hopefully the game. So this is how we approach such positions. So try to find vulnerable objects or areas of the board in your opponent's position. And let's proceed to another example. And this time we need to flip the board so that we have black's perspective. This is perhaps a bit of an easier example, but it's also connected with more than one tactical pattern, and that's perhaps a bit of a difficult part here. So the principles are pretty much the same. You need to find targets for your pieces. You need to check what can be hit, what can be the target for your pieces, and how to take advantage of this. as usual, forcing moves should be the ones that you check first, that you calculate as the first ones. So as usual, I would strongly encourage you to take a look at this and try to solve this position on your own. I hope you're going to be able to find this. In a few seconds I'm going to give you the answer, so if you feel you need some time and you really want to test your skills, then please pause the video. Okay, so the target here is obviously the pawn on f3. This is hit by both the knight on e5 and the bishop on c6, so this is already quite a big of a pressure. So both of these two pieces, I didn't mean that. Okay. Both of these two pieces are attacking the pawn on f3 quite effectively, but at the same time the bishop on d1 provides white with decent defensive resources. So what needs to be done is, first of all, checking if there is any way to increase the pressure on the pawn on f3. So that would pretty much mean that black needs to find another piece that could attack the pawn on f3. As you can already imagine, it's not possible to bring the rook to e3 or f4 any soon. f4 would just be bad, and jumping with the rook from h8 to e3 will really require really good imagination and quite a lot of moves. So that will never work. So the second thing is to check whether this is actually a problem that the bishop on d1 protects the pawn on f3. Perhaps there is a tactical idea which enables us to win the pawn straight away. And here exactly such a situation exists. But in order to find this continuation, you need to know an idea which is called decoy, and which is going to be subject to separate will be subject to analysis in a separate chapter. But here, for the purpose of this introduction, well, we are going to mix those two ideas, but in a, I would say, relatively simple example. So first, black takes on f3, bishop takes f3, and now the key move, rook h2. This is exactly the move which is needed to be found in advance in order to be able to properly determine the consequences of this whole line. Because only after the king is lured to h2, then, even though black is down a whole rook here and the piece, first of all he takes the bishop with a tempo. Then after king goes back, for example, to g2, we take on d4 with material advantage, and normally I would say that this is already a huge success, but since we're talking about advanced calculation and not necessarily just pattern recognition, but also properly approaching positions involving tactics, I will also mention that this is not the final step of your analysis. So whenever you're calculating a line in your brain, you cannot finish by finishing the calculation. And normally you would finish the calculation process once you run out of forcing moves, once the position does not contain any forcing continuations, any straightforward lines. But this is not the point. The point is that you need to follow your calculation with a proper evaluation of the resulting position. So in other words, it's not enough to find a beautiful combination if at the end of the day you still get a lost position. So objectively, you should always be looking for a continuation which gives you the best practical chances. Here actually we do have very good practical chances, but this works basing on the assumption that you know how to evaluate knight endgames. So this is actually the tricky part in this position, because less experienced players could be afraid of entering this forced sequence because they would not know that well, basically you evaluate knight endgames as if they were pawn endgames. So you try to imagine how you would evaluate this position if there were no knights on the board. So since the pawn endgame, and this applies to really great majority of positions, I would say 90% of positions. So if you know that this position should be winning for black, the pawn endgame should be winning for black, then this means that most probably black should be winning the knight endgame. And this in fact is very true, because the pawn on c4 is still very weak. The pawn on b2 also will need to be protected. Black has a very nice active pieces, and also the pawn formation, especially the pawns in the center, favors black a lot. But this is exactly the point behind practically calculating every single line. You cannot finish by just calculating, just finishing the forcing line. You need to take it a step further and try to assess the resulting position. This is where you can actually, after of course the position you get in your calculation you're happy with, then you can make the move on the board. The move that you calculated can be executed. Those players who would be afraid of playing this position would probably just play a move like knight g4 or rook g8 or something else, simply because of the fact that they would not know that this knight endgame is actually a very promising position. And one last remark: if you calculate this line, of course, as usual, you need to check if there are any hidden resources. So in this case the position is really straightforward. Unless white takes on h2, he's really, well, practically lost. Of course he could still try his chances in a position with king f1, knight f3, some retreat of the rook, for instance to f4, but then I'm not really sure what white achieves by this, because the rook on h2 is very active. It is nicely positioned. I think knight e5 should be enough for maintaining huge advantage, and I don't really see what problems were solved by white. And I think this is a good point to wrap things up for this very first clip, besides the intro, of course. And what I would like you to remember after watching this video is the thinking process behind calculation. So this is not only pattern recognition, but what I'm trying to show you here is proper calculation technique. So first of all, that you should try to find areas or objects on the board which are vulnerable in your opponent's position. Then find the applicable resources, so pieces and pawns that could be used when executing this, when taking advantage of these exposed objects or areas of the board in your opponent's position. And lastly, which is really important aspect of calculation, and many people forget about it, evaluate the resulting position. Because if you're not happy with the resulting evaluation, you should not go for the line that you have calculated. Okay, I hope this was instructive for you, that you learned something new. If not, go to the next video. I'm pretty sure there will be something interesting there. Thanks for watching.